All right, that seems to be up and running. So let's get down to work. So we are now in the midst of a time known as Spirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, which stretches between Pesach and Shavuot. And as such, it is only appropriate that we talk about Shavuot and the counting of the Omer. So with that, let's get this moving. Now, when I'm talking about the counting of the Omer, what are we talking about? Well, if we look at Leviticus 23, we can see the following commandment. And you will count from the morrow after the day of rest, the day of Shabbat, from the day that you brought the omer of the offering, 7 complete weeks. And the day after the 7th week will number 50 days, because, of course, 7 times 7 is 49, add 1 more is 50, and you will offer a new grain offering to the Lord. So, as you can see, it is telling us that we are meant to count. Now, I put in parentheses the word Pesach because sometimes there is a little bit of confusion about the identity of this day of rest. There are some who try to interpret it in a faulty manner, believing that since the word Shabbat usually means the day at the end of every 7 days when we have a day of rest, that it must mean that here as well. They would then interpret this to mean that from the Shabbat during Pesach, we count 7 weeks. That simply is not true. First of all, that would mean that Shavuot would come on a different day every year rather than being fixed to a feature of our lunar calendar. And secondly, it's simply not the correct language. So yes, the word Shabbat does often mean the day number 7 of the week, but sometimes it does simply mean a day of rest. The word Shabbat is an actual word, not only a proper noun for the day of the week, and it's a word that means cessation. For example, here in Leviticus 23, as well, we also see that as well, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are referred to as days of Shabbat. Now, since clearly those are not actually Shabbat, because one of them is 10 days after the other, which would mean that both of them could not happen on a Shabbat in the same year, we can be assured that indeed the day Shabbat does not always mean day 7 of the week. In this context, for the Omer, as well as for many others, we have to take Hebrew as it means in context, not only as our superficial understanding might lead us to believe. So, we start counting the day after Pesach. That means here in the diaspora, outside the land of Israel, where we have a 2nd day observance of the first day, meaning the Seder, as well as the 2nd day services, that we start counting during that evening of the 2nd day, meaning the evening of the 2nd night Seder. And each night, we then will count with the proper blessing, and we count through each night up until that time. Now we count each night both the day and the week. Why is it that we're counting both the day and the week? Well, because we are counting the days, but we are also reminded that we are told of how many weeks it will be, which leaves just enough ambiguity that perhaps it is the weeks that we are meant to be counting, or at least in addition. In order to cover the bases, we make sure to announce how many days it is, as well as to announce how many weeks plus days that makes. It's just one of the many belt and suspender aspects of Judaism. Now, if you forgot a day by mistake, you can continue to keep counting, but since we are unsure whether that actually counts as the mitzvah, as the counting, because it may be only the totality that is important rather than each individual one, then it is proper to no longer say the blessing, lest we use God's name in vain, what's called a bracha levatala, saying a blessing over something which is not, in fact, a mitzvah. So that is the short of the counting cycle. Now, during this time period, there are other aspects, other traditions, other things that are taking place. In particular, during this time of the counting of the Omer, specifically from the end of the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, which is what we are in at the moment, which is considered to be a joyful month, So once this month is done, through the counting of the omer, or up until Lag BaOmer, depending upon different traditions, it is a period of semi-mourning. It is a period where we limit some of our rejoiceful activities. Now, the reason why goes back to the Talmud, taken from Masechet Shabbat 54b. They said, Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples living from Gabat to Antipatrik. All of them died in a single season. Why? Because they did not treat one another with respect. It was taught that all of them died between Passover and Shavuot. So the basic story tells us that there was a problem between the students, and that problem allowed for a catastrophe to take place, and that catastrophe wiped out these many thousands of students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, we don't get any more detail in the Talmud other than the timeline, which is, of course, the timeline of the counting of the Omer, but other traditions have been preserved, which give us a little more insight. So from Rav Shriya Gaon, he said, Rabbi Akiva raised many students, but there was a religious persecution, what's known as a shmada, on the students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, why would there be a persecution against his students in particular? Well, we can see in the Jerusalem Talmud, Rav Shimon ben Yochai taught, Akiva, my master, would expound the verse, a star will come from Jacob as Koziba, meaning Kochba, which is another way of saying star. A star will come from Jacob. When Akiva would see Bar Koziba, who was a Jewish leader that led a revolt against Rome, he would say, there is the King Messiah. Akiva believed that Bar Kochba, Bar Koziba, would be the Redeemer, would be the Messiah that would lead us to our independence and in the suffering under Rome. It didn't work out, and indeed, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta would say, Akiva, grass will grow from your cheeks, and still the Son of David will not come, meaning the Messiah will not have arrived until long after you are dead. And unfortunately, Ben Torta was right. Bar Kochba, Bar Koziba, the one that Akiva thought was a Messiah, failed in the revolt, and there was massive persecution, massive repercussions that caused the death of many, the enslavement of many, and the suffering of many more. Excuse me. It is often hypothesized, reading between the lines, that this is the religious persecution that was taking place, and that the death that happened were the reprisals. That Rabbi Akiva's students would, of course, have followed him in supporting Bar Kochba, and as such, they would have been targets for Roman reprisals at this point. And as we know, Rabbi Akiva himself was caught and tortured to death by the Romans, and so too would have happened to his students. It is very interesting, though, that our sages didn't teach us only about the persecution, but more to the aspect that was within our control, which is what was lacking among the students that allowed that sort of persecution to take place, and that was mutual respect. Indeed, the idea that the lack of mutual respect among scholars as well as Jews at large has often been the primary cause for why enemies would be able to cause us great grief. Questions or comments on this so far? All right. So there's another reason why this has been preserved, this tradition of mourning, and that is because during the time after Passover, it was very dangerous for Jews. Beginning in the Middle Ages in particular, there was what's known as the blood libel, something we talked about in the class on anti-Semitism, where we would often be accused of having kidnapped and murdered a Christian child as part of our Passover rituals. Obviously, nothing is further from the truth, but this was the lie and the slander that was perpetrated, which meant during the period after Pesach, we would be on edge, worried that some child's disappearance would be blamed on us and that there would be a catastrophe within the community. And so it was a good time to keep our head down and hope that in that particular year, that the Christians would not come after us and persecute us further. And that meant that there was indeed a somber mood throughout that period as well, not only because of the history of Rabbi Akiva. So what sort of mourning practices do we keep since we are not formally mourners? Well, it is customary not to cut your hair, to shave your beards, to avoid unnecessary celebrations or purely social entertainment, such as concerts. This is why during this time period, we, except in emergencies, will avoid having things like weddings. Of course, bar mitzvahs or a brit milah, celebration of a child's life, is usually not schedulable, or we can't reschedule it. When a child is born, 8 days later, the brit milah is necessary for the boys. A bar mitzvah should be close to the age of maturity as possible. So those, of course, we continue to have. But other more optional events, we do try to reschedule. Also during this time period, on the 33rd day, we will have a day called Lag Bomer. Now, Lag is essentially an acronym meaning 33, remembering that Hebrew letters can have numerical values. Lamed is 30 and Gimel is 3. So Lag, Lamed Gimel, is the 33rd day in the counting of the Omer. This year, that'll be May 18th, 19th, meaning from the evening of the 18th through the day of the 19th. And this 33rd day has a special feel to it. Now, the celebration that we are aware of, the customs that we keep, are about 1,000 years old. So it doesn't quite go back as far as some other customs and commandments. And indeed, it is not a formal commandment, but it is a very strong tradition. And there are a couple of reasons for why Lag BaOmer is special. One is that it is considered by tradition that this was the day that the plague, the destruction, the death of Rabbi Akiva students stopped. And so having weathered the worst of the catastrophe, there is cause for celebration. Lag BaOmer is also traditionally believed to be the yahrzeit, the day of passing, for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And he is very famous as being the supposed author of the Kabbalistic text, the Zohar. And for this day of Lag BaOmer, there is a lifting of the mourning restrictions. And so people can get haircuts, they can trim their beards and all that sort of thing. It is also customary to light huge bonfires, and many people will have the custom of ushparin, which is an Eastern European custom that was adopted by some Hasidic groups of the first haircut of a child's life. And it is also customary in Israel to visit Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi's grave in Meron in the north of Israel. As a word of warning, last year there was a catastrophe at the graveside on Lag BaOmer due to flagrant violation of all safety standards. Too many people had been put into an area that was impossible for people to be in, and this led to a crush, and there were many deaths. This year, it is hoped that that will be avoided, that people will abide by the proper regulations and the proper guidance of safety officials to ensure that there is no such loss of life. But let's come to Shavuot itself, which will be on the 50th day, meaning June 4th and 5th, meaning the evening, and then first day on the 5th, and then the second day will be on the 6th of June. Now, Lag BaOmer has 3 different titles, 3 different names, and each of them reflects a different aspect and a different reason for the holiday. The first that we'll talk about is Chag HaKatzir, which is known as the Feast of the Harvest. Katzir is literally the harvesting, the cutting of the grain, and the Feast of the Harvest, of the first fruits of your work and of what you sow in the field. This is a harvest holiday. And then also we know it as Chag HaBikurim, meaning that this is the first fruits holiday, as we see in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers. Also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new meal offering to the Lord in your feast of the weeks, another name for Shavuot, as we'll see, you shall have a holy gathering, you shall do no work. and of course Chag HaShavuot or Chag Shavuot. Then you shall observe the Feast of Weeks for the Lord your God, offering your free will contribution according as the Lord your God has blessed you. So whether we call it the Feast of the Harvest, the First Fruits celebration, or the Feast of Weeks, we are talking about Shavuot as our normal category. Now, each of these has a slightly different flavor, which is important. And most Jewish holidays have multiple layers of meaning and content. So the first is the idea of this Chag HaKatzir, the holiday of the harvest. And to understand that, we have to look a little bit at the timeline of agriculture in the land of Israel. So Pesach is really the beginning of the harvest season. This is when the winter famine, the long period going without new growth from the major crops in the field, finally comes to an end as the early barley harvest can begin to be gathered in. And indeed, it is from that barley harvest that we offer the omer, the portion that is from which the entire counting of the omer is named. And so that barley harvest that happens at the time of Pesach, is very, very important emotionally if you are a farmer, or indeed anyone in the ancient world living off the land, because it was a great relief once that harvest began. Throughout the Omer period, these 7 weeks, we would continue this springtime harvest, gathering in more of the barley and more of the other crops and things that would begin to come in. Shavuot itself is known as Chag HaKatzir because this is the beginning of the real wheat harvest. And the wheat harvest was the most important harvest because it was the most essential for the quantity of calories that would be needed to keep people alive through the coming year. And as such, wheat was not just tasty, but it was absolutely vital for keeping a family, a community alive. As such, it is no surprise that Shavuot coincides with the celebration of that moment, of that ripening wheat that's there in the fields to be brought in. It's also then should be no surprise that at the time of Shavuot, we only have the day of Shavuot, 2 in the diaspora, for our holiday, because the rest of our time is needed to be actually harvesting. In Pesach, the pace is a little more relaxed. We have 7 days off because the harvest is only just barely beginning. At Shavuot, we only really have time to be grateful and joyful for that moment, and then we have to get back to the fields and put our back to it. Throughout the summer, we work hard through those long days of summer, and then Sukkot time, everything has been gathered in, the barns are full, the silos are packed, everything is prepared, and the surplus that cannot be stored is being eaten in the holiday of Sukkot, in our great celebration. So as much as we think of Sukkot as being the harvest holiday, it is only the end of the harvest holiday. Shavuot is really the beginning of the main harvest, and Pesach is the beginning of the preliminary harvest. Now, I've mentioned this phrase, first fruits, a number of times, and it's important to understand what's going on here. So the bikurim, the first fruits, were a special offering that was brought to the temple, and it was brought from Shavuot onwards. Now, the offerings were brought not from everything that was grown, but was from the things for which Israel was famous. There are 7 types of things mentioned in Deuteronomy 8 that are to Israel's everlasting glory: the wheat, the barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. And all of those would be brought from Shavuot forward for celebration. And to understand what bringing meant and the joy that went along with it, this is the passage that comes from the Mishnah on this aspect of the holiday. At the rise of morning, an official says, "Rise and let us go up to Zion, to the house of the Lord our God," meaning to the temple. An ox walked before them, its horns covered with gold and with an olive crown on its head. The ox is decorated as leading up in this sign of celebration. The Halil, which is a type of flute, was played before them till they reached the vicinity of Jerusalem. Upon coming close to Jerusalem, they sent word ahead and decorated their bikurim. The packages that they were bringing with their offerings would be adorned, like people still wrap presents. With baskets still on his shoulder, the Israelite read, I have told the Lord your God this day that I have come to this land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give to us. My father was a wandering Aramean, the rest of that paragraph, and God brought us to this place, and God gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and now I bring the first fruits of the land that you have given me, O God. This passage is taken from Deuteronomy 26, and you'll recognize that this also forms one of the major sections of Magid, the section of the Haggadah that teaches us the story of the Exodus. So there is another thematic link between Passover and Shavuot. By reciting this passage in Pesach, we are anticipating its fulfillment at the holiday of Shavuot. After completing the entire portion, he places the basket by the side of the altar, he bows down, and he goes out. Questions or comments on the first fruits? Okay. Well, we also have to recognize that in addition to being the time of the harvest, in addition to being the time of the first fruits, and in addition to being the fulfillment of the 7 weeks, there is another time, another term that's used for the holiday of Shavuot, and that is Zman Matan Torah, the time of the giving of the Torah. Now, this is not a title that is given explicitly in the Torah, but it is indicated implicitly. And if you follow what I'm about to say, you'll understand why. So from Exodus 19, we get a little bit of timeline. It says that on the third new moon, on Rosh Chodesh of the, which would mean, sorry, let me get this straight. On the third new moon, which means that on the Rosh Chodesh of the third month, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Now that means to the vicinity of Mount Sinai, where we would receive the Torah. So what does that mean? Well, the first month, of course, is the month of Nisan. The second month is the month of Iyar, and the third month is the month of Sivan. So we are now at the point on Rosh Chodesh, on the third new moon, where the Israelites come in to the area around Mount Sinai. We then see in Exodus 19, this time verse 6, that we get a speech where God says, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. This is followed up by setting of boundaries around Mount Sinai, as well as instructing there to be a period of abstinence. So when you count that up, the days end up being that on the 6th of Sivan, we would receive the Torah. And indeed, that is Shavuot. So although the Torah did not say specifically, oh, by the way, Shavuot was the day that you got the Torah, the timeline that is implied by the Torah makes it relatively clear. This is one example, as we've talked about in the past, where the Torah does not always spell things out as blatantly as we might expect a modern book to do so, because it demands, encourages us to think about what we are hearing and to work out many of the details for ourselves and in conversation. So we end up with Shavuot having this additional, very important flavor of being the time when we receive the Torah. Which means we can now see that all three of the pilgrimage holidays, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, are linked not only through the agricultural cycle, but are also linked through the cycle of the Exodus. Passover, of course, is the ending of slavery, very obvious. The omer is the march to Mount Sinai. Shavuot then is the giving of the Torah. Summer recognizes the long march and work on our way towards the land of Israel. And Sukkot represents the literal shelters that we lived in that time in the wilderness, which of course also is reflective of God's protective care over our people. And so really the Exodus is mapped through these three holidays, each with a flavor which is properly connected to the different season as well, so that we have the feeling of liberation, the feeling of moving towards an even greater stage, the fulfillment of our liberation through the giving of Torah to give purpose to our freedom, the continued work now with the Torah with us that is complemented by God's protection, which is allowing for the fullness and enjoyment of life as represented in the holiday of Sukkot. It's very tidy, very neat, and you have to be impressed by the author. At least I hope you're impressed by the author. All right. Now, that time of the giving of the Torah gives Shavuot this additional emphasis, which is then connected to the reading of the Book of Ruth. Megillat Ruth, the Book of Ruth, is one of the 5 different sections of Tanakh, of the Bible, that are read on different holidays. And we read from Ruth on Shavuot, not just because it is the harvest season in that book, but also because of the acceptance of Torah that is displayed by Ruth. Specifically, we'll see the harvest here from Ruth 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me please go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said unto her, this is Naomi, "Go, my daughter." So we can see that the major events of the story of Ruth take place during this summer season of harvest, this time of Shavuot. And as far as the Torah acceptance goes, from the first chapter of Ruth, we hear, "But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." So we see her connecting herself to not only her mother-in-law Naomi, but also to Judaism very passionately and powerfully through her dedication to be part of the community. And then, of course, throughout the story of the Book of Ruth, we can see her demonstrating her deep understanding of Judaism and her outstanding character. So it is a very fitting book to read at this holiday of Shavuot. Now, this concept of accepting the Torah is something that I want to also touch on because as a concept, it can sometimes be a little unclear. What do we mean by accepting the Torah, and what do we mean happened at Mount Sinai? So this is a section taken from the Talmud. It's going to be on two pages, so bear with me. "When the end of days arrive, and the nations of the world stand before God to be judged, they will say to him, 'Lord of the world, in point of fact, did you actually give the Torah to us? And did you give Torah to us and refused to accept it?'" Meaning, can you really blame us for acting as we have when we were not even offered the Torah? But how can they present such an argument? Since it is written, "The Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir. To them he shined forth from Mount Paran," which, as understood in Deuteronomy 33, is talking about God moving to those other countries, meaning traveling. God came from Teman, also in Habakkuk. Now, what in the world did he want in Seir? What was he looking for in Paran? Said Rabbi Yochanan, "This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, made the rounds of each and every nation and language, and none accepted it, until he came to Israel, and they accepted it." So this Midrash is trying to teach us that God did not only offer the Torah to us, but God offered it to the whole world. Now, whether or not we believe that there was a literal analog to Moses offering the Torah to all is something that would be of an interesting debate. But more importantly, as God is the God of all creation and all humans are connected to God equally through their ancestry back to the origin of the world, all of us can, in point of fact, connect to God. And thus all of us can, to a lesser or greater degree, hear the command of God, hear the draw of God towards instruction, towards commandment. And so if it was not heeded, that call of the soul, then you cannot say that it wasn't given. You cannot say that God didn't try. And this is implying, of course, that the Israelites were unique at that time for accepting, for choosing to hear that call, to choosing to hear the commands of God and to make it part of their faith. Instead, however, there will be a different rebuttal, meaning the other nations will still be complaining about the unfairness of the judgment. This is what the nations will say in their defense. Did we accept the Torah, but then fail to fulfill it? Right? But to this, the answer must be, why didn't you accept it at all? So the first rebuttal would be, well, we never said we were going to do it, so that means you can't hold us responsible for our bad behavior. But of course, if you knew that it was being offered, how could you turn down what God was offering to you as instruction? Instead, our final rebuttal of what they will give is, this is what they will say before God. Lord of the world, did you hold a mountain over us like a vault, as you did to Israel? And then, did we refuse to accept it? Now, what do they mean by God holding a mountain over the people? As it is written, and they stood at the base. Now that word base is literally tachat, meaning beneath or under the mountain. Rav Dimi Bar Hama said, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, held the mountain over Israel like a vault and said to them, if you accept the Torah, well and good, and if not, then this will be your grave. Now this may feel like a coercive statement, but I think it needs to be understood not as a threat, but as a simple historical explanation. God is saying to this small group of people scattered here in the corner of the Sinai Peninsula that if they wish to take the Torah, then they will continue as a people, as a nation, to go forward together and have this unique heritage and destiny. If they reject the Torah, then they are as good as dead as far as being a people. That it is only the Torah that united us, pulled us together, and gave us the strength and ability to withstand 3,000 years of history, and some very dark history indeed. That without the Torah, that we would be dead and buried long ago, as all of the ancient cultures and empires were. And certainly beyond the empires, all of the lesser non-conquering nations also were swept off from the earth as the cycle of history continued to roll. It was only Israel that continued to endure and survive despite all of that. And God is making that clear. The Torah will be our life, and it will be our path to eternal life, life both in this world and life in the world to come. And if we chose to reject it, then we would be essentially cutting ourselves off from all of that. And that is the same as being dead. So accepting the Torah is accepting life. It is accepting the instructions because we recognize that through them, we are given life. And through them, we will always be able to find strength to overcome whatever challenges there may be, and the strength to celebrate whatever joys there may be. Questions or comments? All right. Now, there are other customs for Shavuot, apart from just the Torah reading and the singing of Hallel and the normal changes. There are some other activities that we get up to. One of the most famous is called the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And this evening celebration on the evening of Shavuot encourages a person to stay up all night, excuse me, in study. Now, why? Well, because of a midrash's careful reading of the text, it seems to imply that the Israelites went to bed early the day before the giving of the Torah, so they would be well rested, which makes perfect sense. But that when it came time for the Torah to be given, the people were still asleep, and God had to rouse us, had to wake us in order to be able to accept the Torah. As such, in around 1533, Rabbi Joseph Caro, who also wrote the Shulchan Aruch and many other important works, began a practice of studying all night in order to prevent that kind of activity again, the being late for services, and to show our devotion to Torah. This then would be a repair, a tikkun, for our earlier error. We would be taking the mistake that we had made and fixing it by doing the exact opposite, staying up all night in engagement with the Torah. Now, not everyone stays up all night, but it is still our custom to have a community get together for the evening of Shavuot, and to not only have our service, but to also celebrate the Torah by studying its teachings in many different ways. Stay tuned for more information on how we plan to do that this year as a community. We have been more limited over the last couple years because of COVID, and we are trying to come up with something suitable for this year. It is also the custom to eat dairy on Shavuot. All other holidays we eat meat, unless you're a vegetarian, as meat was always a rare aspect of our diet in the ancient world, and as such it was saved for special occasions, such as a holiday. But on Shavuot, there was a custom to eat dairy instead. Now, to be honest, we don't know exactly where this custom came from. It seems to have developed organically in different places, and it is unclear exactly what the spark was. Now, from my mind, because I got an opinion too, I like the teaching that since God had told us that we could only eat meat properly prepared, but we had not yet been given the fullness of Torah until Sinai, we didn't know how to properly prepare meat. As such, we were on a meat-free diet until after Shavuot. To commemorate our willingness to wait and to hear God's instructions before we would eat, we eat dairy as a reminder of that patience that our people had. Others also have a beautiful idea that since we are talking about a land of milk and honey, and since we know that honey and milk are also talked about in Shir HaShirim as being under the tongue, and since being under the tongue, we are talking about midrashically the giving of Torah, it seems that honey and milk would be very appropriate for our celebration. As honey doesn't make much of a meal, but dairy certainly can. Dairy has become the more dominant of those two as a customary dish. This is one reason why many people will talk about Shavuot as being the holiday of cheesecake, or the holiday of blintzes, or the holiday of ice cream. All of which are great fun to have. I mentioned at the very beginning, sorry, I should point out we're changing topic here just because I know I have a little extra time. I mentioned at the beginning that during the period of the counting of the omer, we don't trim our beards, as well as other signs of mourning. So I thought I would also take a little time this evening to talk about what is up with our beard and hair and other aspects of Jewish observance that takes care of the hair. So we see in Leviticus 19 that we are told, you shall not round off the corners, the word Peyote, on your head, or destroy the corners of your beard. All right, now we have our basic idea. Let's see what that means. Well, also in Leviticus, we get a little more clarity. They shall not make baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corners of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. That last one, by the way, is the source of the prohibition on tattoos in Judaism. And then in Deuteronomy 14, further, you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. It would seem that the shaving of a face and the cutting of the corners was often associated with various ritual or funerary rites in the ancient non-Jewish world. And so we might partly have been setting ourselves apart by avoiding following those customs. But what does that mean is actually required of us now in the modern world? Well, according to the Talmud, if a man makes a baldness on his head, or rounds the corner of his head, or mars the corner of his beard, then he has violated this commandment, but he is only liable if he takes it off with a razor. Because of the unique language that the Torah uses for the removing of this, it is clear that it is done through an actual scraping of a razor against the skin. And similarly, that means that with regards to women, anyone who is subject to the prohibition of destroying the corners of the beard is covered by the prohibition of rounding, meaning the Peyote. But women who obviously are not subject to the prohibition of marring the corners of the beard, because they don't have them, are also not subject to the prohibition of rounding. So women, you don't have to worry about having a beard, and you don't have to worry about having peyote, the hair on the side of your head. You are allowed to deal with those as you wish. For men, we are commanded not to use a razor against the beard or the corners of our head, for then we would be in violation of the Torah. So what does that mean practically in the modern world? Well, we can look to Ritba, which is still from the Middle Ages, but I think it'll make it clear. According to the letter of the law, if one shaves with scissors, meaning trims, reduces, shortens the length of the hair on the face or the corner, even in a way that is similar to a razor, meaning even if you trim with scissors so finely that it has the same result as though there was a razor, it is permissible. So that you are absolutely capable of using scissors to trim the corners of your head or to trim a beard, and that is fine. But to use a razor, whether it be a straight razor or a safety razor, then that would be the violation. However, as he points out, it is customary among pious individuals not to do so, due to suspicion by onlookers. And this is indeed the proper way to behave. So he does encourage us to keep beards and to not overly reduce the corners of our on the side of our head, in order that it not look like we've been using razors to do so. Now, in the modern world where it is very common to have electric razors that work off a scissor type motion, I don't think that suspicion is quite such a problem, because it is well known that it is easy to be clean shaven without using a razor. And whether or not it matters to have a beard, we'll look to a more modern author who I don't agree with on many things, but I did find his teaching on this to be pithy. He was asked, what is preferable, a Torah teacher with a beard or a Torah teacher without a beard who can explain better? And his answer was, the one who explains better, since learning Torah is a greater mitzvah than having a beard. So yes, if you have two different teachers and one has a giant full beard but isn't a great teacher, and the other doesn't have a beard because they use the electric razor to be clean shaven, but they are very good at teaching, you go to the person who teaches best, because Torah itself is a primary mitzvah, whereas having a beard is only a mitzvah if you have no way to trim it in compliance with the Torah. And such, it is certainly possible, and many men do use electric razors to be clean shaven, or use an electric razor to trim a beard rather than allowing it to grow unimpeded. I should also point out, just as a little FYI, with regards to the mustache, everybody agrees you can trim that as you need in order to keep it out of your food. And just as a little graphic at the end, I really need to update this with something clearer, but hopefully it's not too bad on your devices. When we talk about the peyote, the corners of our head, since a head is round, you may be wondering where that is. And it is an imaginary line. Let's see if I can turn like this, from the temple where the hairline turns down past behind the ear. And the area below that is the area that is peyote. So we would not take a razor and shave off that corner of our head. You may have seen in many pictures, and certainly in many stereotypes, Jewish people having very long sections of hair growing from there, often in curls. It has become customary in some communities to twirl that as a person might be reading or studying. And so it becomes sort of a demonstration of their commitment, their learning. Of course, you can also use hair curlers to get the same effect, but that is where that custom originated. But you do not need to grow that out. If you want to use scissors or other types of trimming implements that are not razors, you can keep that as neat and tidy as is comfortable for you. All right. That is the end for today. Do people have any questions that they would like to ask before we wrap it up? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. Remember to keep asking questions in your own time, and I'm always available for private discussion. And I will see you all for our next Pathway to Judaism next Thursday.
Thank you.